Okay, hello. So, I'm Jay Herrera, and I did my research assignment on Baroque art and the historical relevance of religion during the time that they were developed. Okay, so Baroque art, like many art forms, is typically characterized by a few shared key traits that connect different works of art. Examples of these would usually be the exaggerated movement of the human form and emotional exuberance or drama that is displayed in many aspects of Baroque artworks. Beyond this, however, many Baroque arts also display connections to both paganism and Catholicism or Christianity. This is especially interesting considering the history of conflict and greatly different periods of rule between the two religions. Thus, when looking at the often overlapping religious iconography that is present across Baroque art, one can also consider the impact that paganism and Catholicism has had throughout history and how it has directly influenced the artist even beyond its prime. So the three images I chose to represent this specific case were Bacchus by Caravaggio, The Crucifixion of Christ by Velázquez, and The Fall of the Damned by Peter Paul Rubens. Okay, so attitudes towards the church. In 1527 Europe, religious dominance had the power to direct and inform the content and climate of society's artistic output. At the time, backlash against the conservative Protestant Reformation was compelled by the Catholic Church to reestablish its importance in society. So, where the Church's power and influence had during the time of the Dark Age in the 15th century been somewhat stifled, Baroque art returned religious iconography to the public eye. But because of everything that happened, as attitudes changed towards the Church and evolved during its rise and fall in political influence, thus did artistic interpretation to divine imagery. Okay, so the 17th century and the 30 Years' War. During the 17th century, the period that best coincides with the production of Baroque art, religious and dynastic conflicts led to the constant conflict of the 30 Years' War, visiting violence and destruction against ordinary people. As more people became direct spectators to the chaos of the religious and political world, it can again be identified as influence in the art of the period. Where beforehand, religious imagery had primarily exhibited the peaceful and serene concept of salvation and divine protection, Baroque works displayed a much more widely varied interpretation. The Crucifixion of Christ by Diego Velázquez contributes an element of this in the raw and sometimes difficult to look at portrayal of Christ's bloody crucifixion. It is accompanied by nothing else, forcing the viewer to address the barbaric action and having the tones of yellow in the paint interrupted only by Christ's bloody appendages. As this work was developed during the war, Velázquez may have directly intended it as a critique of the militarization of religious intolerance. This is especially relevant when considering that one of Ferdinand II's first actions was to force citizens of the empire to adhere to Roman Catholicism, even though religious freedom had been granted as part of the Peace of Augsburg. Utilizing Christ's crucifixion, a direct result of Roman punishment, Velázquez contextualized the situation for his own present-day experiences. Peter Paul Rubens' The Fall of the Damned, which was created less than 10 years earlier than Velázquez's own work, also, like that of Velázquez, was created amidst the 30 Years' War, and further demonstrates the effect that real-life religious conflict held on artistic expression. The canvas is overwhelmed by a chaotic fight, so cluttered together that it is difficult to distinguish exactly what is taking place. Emotionally, this could mimic the average person's reaction to the events that surrounded them as the war progressed. From the standpoint of artistic development, it further expresses the shift in how religious stories were presented from their original, idealized, and glorified tradition. Okay, so pagan influences. Interestingly, religious imagery in Baroque art extends beyond just that of the modern Catholic religion. Artists and historians of the time retained great influence from pagan and most specifically Greek mythologies. This was even to the extent that Baroque artists were referred to as migratory, exploring through the conflicting cultures. This blurred line between ancient Greek paganism and the modern-day Europe, birthplace of the Baroque, is most directly facilitated by the participation of Greek political figures in the modern society like Polybius. Polybius, despite being being Greek, was eventually exiled to Italy and eventually Rome, where he both adopted the culture amidst records and documents and presented his own influence through his status. Through this, a clear and consistent thread is begun through the ancient and modern world. In keeping with this, at the time of the early Renaissance, many of the classical works left behind by the pagan period of the past became the focus of analysis and study for emerging and evolving artists. Thus, the past had developed a lasting and inescapable connection to not only the present, but the future. This reignited interest in the pagan coincided with the new exploration of the negative sides of Catholicism and more modern religion, placing them on the same equal opportunity for both praise and scrutiny. This inspired many religious artists to shift between and often back and forth from both types of influence, namely Caravaggio. Bacchus serves as a clear production of Greek influences in its portrayal of the Greek god Dionysus. The fact that a well-celebrated and revered artist like Caravaggio, who was equally active during the time of increasing religious conflict, found inspiration in both Catholicism and paganism in his works, further show the overlapping influence present at the time and the blur between the two in art. So, here are all my sources. Thank you for listening.